Welcome to DevOps and Docker Talk. I'm your host, Bret Fisher. In this episode, I'm joined by the CEO and co-founder of Groundcover to dig into their new observability platform with a twist. It's built from the ground up using eBPF in the agents, and they have a platform architecture that allows you to store all those metrics, logs, and tracings in your own cluster to avoid the premium that traditional monitoring platforms charge. CEO Shahar Azulay joins me to discuss their design decisions and how the Groundcover team provides multiple options for deploying their solution and the benefits of using an on-server agent that's entirely eBPF-based, which means it can detect a lot more of what's going on in your apps without the unusual permissions or lengthy configurations. Unlike the typical monitoring solution, I didn't go deep into the day-to-day features with Shahar because I found their unique architecture and the design to be one of the most interesting choices in their solution, and I dig it, so we talked about it a lot. But without all the great features and using the product day-to-day, you wouldn't care about me obsessing over their cool architecture approach, right? Well, I was also surprised here, as Groundcover is showing off what it's like to create a fresh observability platform in the 2020s, because it's built on so many new standards that didn't exist a decade ago. And I'm thinking that that's going to accelerate your implementation of it. For their dashboard, they support the Grafana dashboard catalog, which means a lot of things you can just plug and play with. They support Prometheus-style metrics collection. They support the PromQL query language that's growing in popularity due to Prometheus. They support the open telemetry endpoint standards, the cloud integrations like CloudWatch and Kubernetes. So if you ask me to deploy this solution today, I feel like their support of modern standards is going to keep me happy. I'm calling Groundcover's system design a hybrid observability architecture from a systems point of view, because it's not quite a full SaaS like similar tools in the space, but it's also not totally on-prem unless you want it to be. It's got a flexible enough design that you are able to pick which things you want to run yourself and which things you'd rather them run. We go into all that and more in this episode, so please enjoy our chat and demos of Groundcover. It's that time again. I'm going to be bringing in my special guest over here, Shahar Azulay. I am so excited to have you. Tel Aviv, by the way, is like, I think we have someone on Tel Aviv every other month. I don't know. It's like my other sister city. Do y'all have sister city ideas over there? It's like my sister city. When I'm not in Virginia, I'm talking to people in Tel Aviv or that area. It's just it's a hotbed. It's crazy. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah. You're the CEO and co-founder of Groundcover, which is I'm going to call it a startup. Maybe I don't know if you consider that maybe if you've considered yourself graduating out of the startup world.
You're always a startup.
You're always a startup. Yeah, that's a good attitude. And I'm 10 years into this Docker thing, and I still feel like I'm a Docker startup. Yeah. So tell me about your background, because I was reading, like you've had time at Apple, I believe, you've had time at other companies, and then in the middle of the pandemic, you decide, there is a problem in the monitoring and observability market. I need to solve it. So how did we get here? What's this about?
Yeah, doesn't sound like a too smart idea, right? In the middle of the pandemic, but that happened. My background is similar to my founder's background, Chaz, which we worked together for many years. And it's all basically revolving around R&D and R&D management in different aspects. Both of us spent a lot of years in cybersecurity, which I think contributed to some part, in some part to why Groundcover is built the way it's built. Why did we choose to, go for kind of the deep tech aspect of observability, I would say. And we'll probably talk about it a bit later. But basically, cybersecurity, machine learning from different aspects over the years, and using these systems, right? Using Grafana, using Datadog, building observability solutions for the teams I worked with just because we had to. And, I assume that's for many reasons, that's probably the main reason of, just using these tools and knowing what works and maybe what's not.
Yeah. In fact, when you and I talked earlier this week, when we were sort of planning out the show, and it kind of struck me, there's lots of ways to talk about all these tools in the cloud native ecosystem nowadays. And sort of, we love to tell stories, those of us that are trying to help others. And it struck me as we've got lots of options in all the areas of tools. If you just go look at the landscape on the CNCF website, right, it's a little overwhelming. Everybody talks about how many players are in there. It's funny because I feel like we've always had, in a lot of places, we've had a gluttony of choice for decades now. But now I feel like we are in this gluttony of choice of open source. And what I think is challenging is that it's hard to figure out what you want to use. And a lot of times you're focusing on, do I do it myself for free, or do I outsource it completely to a SaaS? And it's going to cost me money, but it's going to save me time, right? So I've always feel like it's a choice of time or money. And we were talking about like observability, or just the monitoring and logging world that this all came out of, it always felt like a binary choice of, I have to run all this all myself. I have to figure out how to configure everything myself. There might be open source documentation that I can provide, but I'm probably going to end up on Stack Overflow and in a bunch of, Slack servers trying to find help. And then I've got to run my own storage. I've got to be a storage expert. I've got to be a redundancy expert and all that. It's like you're taking on a part-time job with monitoring. And I often will tell my clients and students, like, just try to avoid running your own, monitoring, even though Prometheus and Loki and all these things are fantastic. Like, unless you have a bunch of free time on your hands, it's a lot of work, especially if you have more than a few servers. So I felt like we've had this choice for a very long time, decades even, of I either have to run it myself or I have to pay someone else to run it. And there's no real middle or hybrid option. I'm going to keep using that word hybrid, even though I feel like it's overloaded right now. Where did you come up with this idea? We're going to get more into it, but where did you come up with this idea of maybe like a middle ground where maybe part of it is self-hosted and part of it is in the cloud? How did that come about?
So I think it first came about from, still sticking to the understanding that, regardless of open source, which is incredible, and we should adopt it for various reasons, right? Mostly due to standards and kind of standardization of the domain itself, right? We shouldn't be, locking people into specific things due to their vendor and so on. So there's definitely advantages to open source. But regardless of that, first understanding that observability is a profession, right? So, even if you're using Prometheus, there's still the fact of how did you choose your cardinality, right? What exactly are you measuring? What queries are you using, right? On top of that Prometheus. So people think it kind of ends there with just, deploying and maintaining that solution. So
right.
once you understand that, what happens to most vendors is you go SaaS, right? Because you say, then I have to be that, housing for my clients. I have to, support them. They don't know how to query the data. They don't know how to choose what to store, how to store. And therefore, I'm going to take that part for them and bring the brains of observability into play. The main driver to go into a different approach is basically that the cost models of these solutions fail to be sustainable. And they're not wrong. That's what I'm trying to say in the basic approach of, should every company just run Prometheus and Elastic on their stack and just go by? If you're a specific company, if you're willing to put down the specific expertise, but it's a profession. So they're not wrong by going there, but eventually the cost models of pricing people for volumes of data they can control or won't take the profession of controlling, eventually creates a situation where it doesn't make sense anymore. And, the open source route itself also doesn't make sense for many companies. And therefore, Groundcover kind of found what we think is the best of breed of saying, we believe in open source. We believe in the fact that it should be transparent and accessible and in your control. But we also believe in the advantages of not marking up costs on hosting it on our side. So maybe let's help you maintain and host it on your side. And basically, that's exactly what we're doing for the last 3 years, which is pretty unique.
Yeah. It's funny that you're talking about this as a professional. That's a great tagline, because there are a few areas, build engineering as well, I feel like is another area that's not just underappreciated, like understanding the full breadth of observability and the platform that you're monitoring from, and just the techniques and the standard processes. It's almost like I feel like if the CNCF was going to make more certifications, which they are on a pretty good clip lately of making new ones, that there should be some sort of observability certification so that you understand telemetry, you understand even from the developer side about adding your own metrics into your actual software and not bolting on after the fact, but actually thinking of it from that point of view, which those people that are at the tip of the spear, that are running, the people that are working at Netflix, the people that are working at these very large tech companies, that is all like old news to them. But there's still a major part of the market that is coming at this from a very traditional mindset of, we will think about monitoring last, we will think about observability last. Once it's in production, we will, install a product, and that we can maybe get our existing engineers to do it without necessarily being a professional operations person. I was that person 20 years ago that came and I lived in operations. There was no DevOps word yet. And I was in the operations group, in the sysadmin group, trying to help the developers go faster and do things more secure and better and quicker and recover faster. We didn't really know and have a lot of those things back in the mid 2000s, but I feel like there's not a lot that's changed in terms of expecting everyone to know a little bit about observability, what that even entails, and then educating people to different parts of your pipeline, whether it's developers or the pre-production people, making sure that, did your observability metric break in testing? Like, not a lot of people are testing their metrics. So there's just a ton of stuff here that I think you could dive into, but I feel like that's almost a separate podcast. Let's talk about the certifications of OpenTelemetry later. But maybe we can break down. Okay, so we're talking about observability. Clearly, Groundcover is an option for people that want to manage the metrics, the logging, the tracing, the traditional monitoring ideas of Kubernetes. Let's talk a little bit about what's unique about the architecture. I'm going to use the word hybrid. I made it up. I don't know if it's even the right word. If you might have a better word for it, but I feel like part of your deployment options, and a lot of people that are watching and taking my courses in the DevOps world are saddled with this. They may not be running all the metrics or creating the Prometheus queries, but they're probably the person that's responsible for deploying it and architecting this out. And one of the biggest challenges usually with Prometheus and Grafana and that whole stack is that it's a huge stack. It actually is not one tool or two tools or even three tools. It's a dozen tools. Yeah. If you want the complete thing that you think of when you think of SaaS monitoring tools. And I think that discourages people, but it also surprises people, I think, a little bit when they come into it and they're like, I can't just look at one of these tools and actually make anything of it. They all work together. There's lots of these different open source tools. So how does your deployment model really shift that, even though it's still partly in cluster?
So in a sense, I think what we're doing from the deployment perspective of the actual backend. I mean, Groundcover is kind of two startups in one, in a sense. One is how we collect the data, which is based on eBPF. Yeah, maybe not another great idea, but we love the hard part, as you understood already. So, the one startup is building that sensor, that collects the data with eBPF, that we can talk about later, but basically, trying to get as much data, as much accessibility, as much coverage, as a faster onboarding as possible into that in-cloud backend. And the other part of Groundcover is basically building that architecture that says, how can we store data on your cloud premises, manage it for you, and so on. One of the things that we're trying to do is first introduce customers to the latest and best technologies that we believe in, right, as part of the backend. And we're very proud of the actual, if you go to Datadog right now or to New Relic, for example, you're not supposed to know, or of course, not necessarily exposed to the technologies that they're using behind the scenes to store your data, right? It's not part of the deal, right? So Groundcover is very proud of the fact that we're using Victoria Metrics and ClickHouse to basically engine the in-cloud behind the scenes. And we're trying to say, we know how to bring these best-of-breed technologies into your cloud while still managing for you. That's interesting for a few reasons. One of them is that, people use Prometheus because they know to use Prometheus or think they know to use Prometheus, right?
Right.
Prometheus.
The internet tells them so.
Yeah, exactly. Prometheus is in that part of the adoption curve, right? When you should know how to use Prometheus, even though there's like a lot of pitfalls along the way. And for example, Victoria Metrics isn't, right? The median DevOps, right, wouldn't just go and try his luck with Victoria Metrics. He will probably go for, Prometheus status stack or something like that. And basically what Groundcover is trying to say is you might not be familiar with these technologies yet, or you might not have even used them yet, but we know how to first make it transparent to you. So you might get exposed to them and might even fall in love with them to your other use cases. But on the other hand, we deploy them in your cloud premises, cloud native over Kubernetes, manage them for you, scale them for you, back them up for you, and make sure that basically you don't have to worry about it if you don't want to. So we talked about, before that profession thing of, should you be a full-time observability engineer? Probably not in most cases, but if you do want to get into that, you definitely can, which is kind of what Groundcover brings to the table. So in-cloud is highly managed. Some of our customers don't care, don't want to know, right, about what exactly is going on there. Right. It just works. And for others, it's much more than that. It's, it's a rich backend that they want to explore, utilize, query deeply with different strategies and kind of learn about these technologies through that. So we kind of see both ends in Groundcover, which again is unique, right? Because you don't get it from your SaaS vendor.
Right. So of course, the risk there is sort of the lack of turnkey. Just when you have to deploy stuff yourself, there's always that additional education instead of saying, just install our agent and then the rest is magic. So you have this concept of in cloud. You mentioned that before. I just wanted to sort of talk about that for a second. Over on your docs, you have sort of a couple of different architecture designs, which I thought was pretty cool for how flexible the product is. And we were talking about in cloud as that feels to me like the default option. Is that how you're looking at it? Is like, this is the model that most of our customers may consider?
So, I mean, the architectural choice that Groundcover took is separating the data plane, the control plane for any flavor of Groundcover. So basically, there is no situation where Groundcover stores your data on the Groundcover premises. We work with companies that are privacy aware. It allows us to break the pricing model that the market offers and price differently. So we're heavily invested in separating control plane and data plane experiences. The product is still SaaS, right? You go to groundcover.com, see dashboards and so on. But eventually behind the scene, it's always an in-cloud architecture. Now it has multiple flavors we can touch on in a second, but the one thing that I would say that describe what Groundcover stands for is we call it frictionless observability. And it's the fact that if we want to do something, then we try to take it to be as out of the box as possible, because we believe that users suffer from moving between solutions and the turnaround time isn't, great, but there is a trigger point because of cost, pain of, coverage, because open telemetry isn't so easy to adopt and a lot of different, other reasons.
Yeah.
As frictionless as possible. So on one hand, eBPF, was super easy to install our agent and everything is magic, as you say, right? And on the other hand, in-cloud is also built to be frictionless. Most people, when they see in-cloud, think, oh, so I should bring my ClickHouse and Victoria Metrics databases, and then you just write there. No. So basically, people actually provision a cross-account role for us, and that's it. We spin up in-cloud for you from the ground up and then manage it for you. So in a sense, beside a few clicks in your AWS, your GCP, or Azure console, you don't have to do anything to spin up Groundcover, even in the backend itself. So you don't have to bring any database, you don't have to spin up any cluster, you don't have to do anything basically to get started. And that is also kind of that magical experience combined with the sensor, which is basically a daemon set you could just install and remove. That's a pretty powerful step, right, to cover sometimes dozens of Kubernetes clusters at once in one single in-cloud.
Yeah. So you've got the advantage of all of the monitoring and logging and tracing data being in the client's or the customer's infrastructure. And we talked about earlier the idea that there are multiple options for sort of the enterprise use case of selecting more and more of the components to be on-prem. So it feels pretty flexible in that way. When I first looked at it, because the deployment model was, all these different options for deploying. There was Argo deployment options, which I love Argo CD, so that was exciting. There's Helm deployment options. And so at first I thought, is this just a Kubernetes monitoring solution? Because it was deploying in Kubernetes, but clearly it's not, right? There's lots of other things that probably your clients have to monitor besides pods inside of Kubernetes. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Groundcover is definitely Kubernetes-centric. First of all, we believe in Kubernetes. We think it's definitely a flexible system, like it has its flaws, but in general, Groundcover believes in that. And therefore, in cloud, for example, we're run on top of Kubernetes. So we will basically use Kubernetes native technologies and manage our in-cloud in Kubernetes. But on the sensor perspective, basically eBPF runs on any Linux-based system, right? It can run, anywhere. You can run on your, local host if you want to. Our choice to be Kubernetes-centric is more oriented around product, because basically once you run the sensor in Kubernetes, using the Kubernetes API, the ecosystem of Kubernetes can, basically provide a lot of context without any user interaction, right? So the hierarchy, names of applications, a lot of stuff that Kubernetes provides, which otherwise you would have to help the vendor, help Groundcover understand in this VM what is running, right? And so on. So you can basically tag the data for us. So we started out that way and then supported a lot of integrations like CloudWatch, Prometheus, OpenTelemetry integrations. a lot of different stuff that we support to basically bring stuff from other cloud resources into Groundcover. And we're about to release very soon also support for EC2, which will basically be our first step to run the sensor inside of Kubernetes. Because although we're Kubernetes centric, we'll probably be there for a while, right? We'll definitely be starting to run outside of Kubernetes into the deployment types of, EC2 or ECS, things like that, to basically allow ourselves to run where there are Linux machines, but the orchestration is in Kubernetes. So we're definitely thinking about it, but right now it's definitely focused around Kubernetes and outside integrations, I would say. The sensor itself will run on Kubernetes itself.
Right. And you've mentioned this several times. I just want to definitely highlight it. For the last 2, maybe 3 KubeCons, whenever we do a live show from there, and we talk about what's on the floor, what's the energy, what everybody's talking about, right? And so for like the last couple of years, eBPF has sort of, I'm going to say peak hype, but that doesn't mean it's not a significant influential technology that's impacting, it seems like almost everything these days in terms of security, networking, and observability. But since you are a relatively new offering, you were able to start with the first release on eBPF. Is that right? Like basically you went eBPF from the ground up from day one.
And I think it's felt like a lot of different stuff. I mean, eventually when you don't start with eBPF, I think the main difference in the company DNA is that you trust the customer to provide the data for you, right? So you come over to a customer and say, you have log collectors, you have open telemetry, right? Just ship it over to us and we're going to blend this experience into something. Right. The disadvantage of that is that this is exactly what Datadog, New Relic, and Dynatrace didn't do 15 years ago, right? They built the entire stack to provide something which is actually kind of a vendor-grade experience of, I have the sensor, it collects the data as I want to. It digests it and stores it as I want to, and it presents it as I want to. And over time, we started losing that into things where companies basically saying, everything is open source now, so I'm not building the agent. I'm just, a sink of all your data, and I know how to correlate and visualize it. And I think that once Groundcover went for eBPF from the beginning, we were kind of not dependent of data being provided by the customer. We definitely integrated with that. So if you have open telemetry, you want to bring it in, right? But even if you install Groundcover on a blank, non-instrumented system, you will get tons of value. And therefore, we can also provide the grade of experience that we believe in. For example, create metrics of the cardinality and control and depth that Groundcover wants. Sample traces in a way that we believe that makes sense. Correlate between different experiences like Kubernetes events and logs and spans in a way that we believe that makes sense. We kind of take ownership of the data from an early on stage while it's actually being collected at the node level. And that's a great advantage. I think that's what made, Dynatrace back then what it is. And later on, Datadog and New Relic. And it's kind of maybe going back a bit, right? Before eBPF, things moved more to the backend side. I feel like with eBPF, we're kind of returning to the origins of observability, where a company like Groundcover, collects the data and then presents it like the full stack approach.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wouldn't call them nightmares, but I definitely have lots of memories from a decade ago of lots of Datadog config files, right? And keeping track of those, and then realizing that you're pointing, this is, I think, actually pre-Docker days that I'm remembering, right when we were all starting to toy around with ephemeral architecture. And so we had EC2 instances that were auto-scaling, and so we needed agents to automatically install. And then we were like, well, these machines over here have a bunch of different logs and different file paths, so then we have to make a config file for that, but this one over here has a different, and we would end up finding out that like, oh, those logs weren't even captured because we didn't configure that server's config file correctly. And of course, containers made that so much easier. But you make a really good point there. Obviously eBPF can be a very technical deep dive, but are you able to sort of detect including logs and tracing inside of this agent? Where's the edges of what this agent can do magically? Because I'm just assuming that it does some things better, but other things must be harder to do in eBPF than maybe a traditional config file, log directories, and endpoint kind of config.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one of the things that eBPF provides you to do is basically break the tiers in how observability products are built. If you think about, why do I have to pay for log management separately and infrastructure monitoring separately and APM separately? Some of the reason behind that is the fact that these things are collected with different technologies, right? You have a log collector basically reading the files, right, and sending them over. and you have an infrastructure agent basically scraping metrics from, exposed metric sources or collecting metrics somewhere else. And you have an APM SDK sometimes instrumented in the client code, right? So these are very different types of technology stacks collecting the data, and therefore different product lines, right?
Right. Different teams probably building those agents, and yeah.
Exactly. So in a sense, once you go with eBPF, you collect the traces on the level that of the sensor itself with no instrumentation for the code. And suddenly you can do everything in the same sensor. You can collect logs, you can collect infrastructure monitoring, and you can also do APM in the same piece of code, in the same integration and correlation you're doing in the sensor. The only thing that we're currently not, say, doing with eBPF classically is around logs, which basically still, resides in files being written somewhere and log collectors knowing how to read them and collect them. And our sensor basically uses eBPF for everything that requires application metrics and tracing and so on, and basically uses the classic log collection from std out and Kubernetes specifically to actually read logs being emitted into files. One of the cool things that we're doing right now, that works, that's great, but Groundcover is also built for very high scale performance using eBPF, kind of puts us there. We're monitoring Redis, Kafka, these huge scale protocols that eventually require a lot of CPU and memory to digest.
Yeah.
And logs is one of those data streams that require a lot of resources to digest and filter and so on. So we're actually moving our ingestion log pipeline from classic files into eBPF for logs as well. And we actually gave a KubeCon lecture about that last KubeCon. It's a very interesting take in the mostly related to performance, right? It doesn't provide a new feature. Actually, logs can be still read from files. But we do pick them up from the eBPF as they're being written, which is very, very cool and allows us to cut down on performance dramatically, sometimes up to 40x, which can be interesting, right? In heavy duty nodes with a lot of applications and containers, dumping huge amount of logs. And you know how it goes, right? When it comes to logs, man. So we're definitely exploring that, but right now it's still classical, I'd say.
Yeah. That's what I was wondering because I was trying to imagine like all the things that eBPF could do, but how difficult would it be to find a log output for a particular process, to identify what container that's in? We have all those today, but those are usually things that are talking to like the Kubernetes API. So they're not really thinking about an individual kernel. They're talking to Kubernetes API, getting data about a container, finding the log endpoint for that container, and then streaming it out. And I was curious if the eBPF abilities, it's one of those things where I feel like it's infinite power, but it also could potentially be infinite complexity. Everybody's raving about the performance advantages and the security advantages of eBPF tools, but a lot of us still aren't using day to day all of our stack having eBPF features lit up in it. So I've just wondered if it was a lack of understanding from a lot of engineers, or if it was just actually pretty hard to take what you maybe were writing before and then turn it into a kernel oriented architecture like that.
So I think one of the misdirections in eBPF is that, since this technology is open source and pretty new, basically, then what happened is that people were, thought to believe that they need to learn it, right? They need to learn how to code it properly and eventually use it for, their kind of usage and code eBPF. I think it's kind of similar to if you think of, say, OpenTelemetry, right? You definitely want to be the user of that, but do you actually want to code the OpenTelemetry ingestion pipeline yourself, right? Not necessarily your skill set, right? So I think eBPF went into, this area of people being so interested in that we saw it in conferences, right? And, in recent years of lectures about coding eBPF and getting into your first eBPF program and so on. To be completely honest, I think that it's a mistake for most developers because this is not something in your, day-to-day skill set, and eventually you will be consuming eBPF-based tools. We're already seeing that in your cloud provider stack, using eBPF for networking. And we will also see that in your security tools, using eBPF to collect security events, or your observability tools, using that to collect traces or whatever. I don't think people should expect to be, the person converting their code to eBPF, but definitely think or be aware about off-the-shelf eBPF tools that they can integrate into their stack to get more rich features or reduce performance issues and stuff like that. But I think we're moving there pretty quickly because the complexity of solutions like Groundcover isn't something that a person can easily do it on their home desktop under 3 hours, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We talked about earlier that if for the last couple of years at any KubeCon, if you're looking at all these cloud native solution booths, there's two trends, right? Is everybody's got this logo, this little B logo. I was trying to zoom into like maximum zoom, but I guess that's a maximum zoom for me. This little bitty B logo is somewhere on their screen or their board, and then something about Gen AI or LLMs or something like that. And I could draw parallels with both of these, as is most of us, if we're just consumers of that particular tool, won't actually have to know how LLMs work or how how to write an eBPF program. And then it's a signal to me, both of those terms are a signal that this company is writing in sort of like the latest gen of the technology that we're all agreeing upon is to be used. I think my first eBPF tool was actually Falco, and my first use of it was, for those that aren't familiar, Falco is a CNCF open source security tool. It sits there and watches through the kernel for bad behavior on your host. And one of my favorite things is it came out of the box with all these rule sets. And one of them was somebody's doing an exec in a pod and they shouldn't be. And so a lot of us, we know that if a hacker is going to get successful, eventually they're going to try to start a shell. Or if they're going to access Kubernetes API, they're going to eventually be able to run an exec, and they're going to try to get into a pod's container. So I love that I didn't have to tell Falco anything other than, here's the kernel, go watch for these bad behaviors. And I feel like that's just one of 1,000 examples, honestly. There's actually, for those that are interested more, if you don't necessarily want to learn eBPF, which is fine, a lot of us don't know it. I don't know. I have no plans to ever know it. There's an actual great documentary on, I think Honeypot maybe created it, on YouTube. So if you just search YouTube for eBPF documentary, it's actually fascinating how it sort of describes the way that the worldwide open source movement actually started changing the Linux kernel and proposing changes, and how it snowballed effect, and nobody knew it was going to be this big of a deal, and now suddenly everybody wants to use it, and all the products are trying to figure out how to take advantage of it. So I feel like it was like the less popular story of LLMs, and how, it's like the nerd version of LLMs. So getting back to this, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, when I look at the website, you're very open about your stack and your compatibility. So even though a lot of this is provided as a SaaS-like or a COTS-like product, where we're saying, here's all the things, they're all pre-configured, everything just works, like just go deploy it. You talk about, storing things in Victoria metrics as a part of your stack that's running in, if it was my Kubernetes, it'd be running in my cluster, not in yours. Using ClickHouse on the front end, that you have Grafana dashboard compatibility. So lots of fans of Grafana out there, especially in getting the coolest looking dashboards to put on that monitor on the wall that you convinced your boss to buy, because you're like, we got to have that 4K giant monitor to show our ops, because everybody needs an ops screen up on even though we all have phones in front of us. And so you have this compatibility with Grafana where people can import dashboards and stuff. So I'm just assuming that part of this is that you didn't want to have to hire 1,000 engineers to create all these things for you. So you just started using all these off-the-shelf open source components. But can you talk a little bit about like what else is in this stack? Like what other things? I mean, we talked about eBPF. It sounds like somehow you've got some sort of Grafana compatibility. We haven't even shown the interface yet, but it just seems like a really cool stack that you've put together of all these different open source cloud native tools.
So as I mentioned before, I think it's kind of part of the value that we provide our customers, our expertise in what we think is kind of best of breed stack to store logs, monitor, traces, events. And basically, once you build a stack that wide, right, you're using eBPF and you're building basically a sensor on top of that digests data at very high scales, and also does a lot of stream processing, like sampling traces and creating metrics on the fly and things like that. And then doing stuff like cardinality reduction, cross-cluster monitoring, things like that. You definitely don't want to be a database company as well, right? I don't think that's a wise choice to say, you know what, I think we can build a better event database to kind of store what we're going to do. And basically, it's kind of being the wiser engineer of how to build on top of these great technologies, something that is deeply related to observability. Because as we mentioned, I don't believe that throwing logs in a database or some kind of data lake and then querying it somehow is enough, right?
Right.
Customers want log pipelines and the ability to create metrics from logs. And visualizations and alerts and different stuff that eventually need to be prefit to what an observability solution really is. So we're using Victoria Metrics and ClickHouse just because they're phenomenal, right? We've benchmarked and tested a lot of technologies. And as much as we like Grafana, for example, we think that the Grafana stack isn't built for the scale that Groundcover works with from the database perspective. Victoria Metrics is Prometheus compatible, which was always a feature requirement at our end, basically knowing, not reinventing another query language for customers, allowing them to query their metrics on top of PromQL, which is very prominent, right? And being able to do stuff as flexible as you want to with things like that. ClickHouse being an SQL engine behind the scenes eventually, and one of the most amazing log analytics databases that we ever encountered. We still have tons of brains on top of that, right? From schemas to reducted views that allows us to query faster to the actual queries you're running on top of that, which are sophisticated and built for scale of our customers. But behind the scenes, we're definitely proud of using these two great products. We're in deep context with the relevant teams, and we definitely see that as a long-term collaboration. And specifically, I think that we see that in most cases when Groundcover makes an impact with a customer, with eBPF all the way through to in-cloud, they get another look at these technologies as well. And, you might find them using that somewhere else, suddenly using Victoria Metrics as a much higher scalability Prometheus data source, for example, regardless of Groundcover. So we want to be as transparent as possible, basically. That's part of the approach.
Yeah. Well, I like that. And this is a PSA, stand on my soapbox moment and tell you all, you may not need or want to run Prometheus. Like, it's a very popular tool. It's been out since cloud native is sort of dawned with cloud native. It's designed for cloud native containers, but it obviously works with lots of other things. But even if you don't want to run Prometheus, learn enough of Prometheus so you learn PromQL a little bit. Now, the cool thing is now most of these tools have query helpers in them so that you can maybe see type ahead and stuff like that, autocomplete, whatnot. When it first started, there was none of that. So we all had to like stare at cheat sheets and manuals and try to figure out our queries. And then, oh, no, that didn't work. Let me try that. Oh, I forgot to print it, parentheses. But that's my PSA moment. Is like, just learn PromQL a little bit so that you feel comfortable even in a moment where you're troubleshooting and you're like, well, we don't have the right dashboard. We don't have the right thing to look at. I need to figure out this versus that. And I can look at the trend. Well, PromQL is the way for you to do that dynamically in real time. So it's kind of like everybody needs to learn a little SQL select statements and stuff like that. Even if you maybe aren't a SQL database engineer, you're going to probably need some of that, even in just DevOps. It's always a little handy thing, kind of like knowing how routers and switches and subnets work. So yeah, PromQL, soapbox, go learn it. It's great. And that was cool. I was also looking through documentation, trying to figure out some stuff, and I noticed the PromQL compatibility and stuff like that. So I know you brought some demos and maybe just get a peek of the product a little bit. What are we going to talk about? What are we going to show off?
So first of all, I want to maybe cover one of the things that we talked about a second ago, and just say that one of the advantages of running in cloud, which I think that is maybe interesting to a specific segment of the market, but I think that segment is kind of diversified, is the fact that Groundcover supports a solution that can be also considered as on-prem, right? So the reason that I wanted to maybe touch on that for a second before we jump into the product itself, because most of the vendors that offer a SaaS solution eventually doesn't support on-prem, since, from the beginning, they basically say, we're going to store your data. That's part of what we're doing. And therefore, in an age where logs and traces include so many sensitive information about your customers, right? Because you're a fintech company, an HR tech company, an ad tech company, it's endless.
Right. No matter how hard you try to keep stuff out of those logs, something's always creeping in.
Exactly. Something's always creeping in. And we definitely see a lot of these more concerned, type of companies already turning into build, right? Turning into storing and maintaining their Elastic and Prometheus and so on. They don't get, it's kind of underserved as a market. They don't get these solutions from Datadog, New Relic, no on-prem option, besides maybe the more heavy-duty solutions of the market like Dynatrace and Splunk. And therefore, Groundcover is able to offer, as a young startup, right, as a kind of more modern solution, the ability to also basically serve these on-prem oriented companies by just running the UI of Groundcover on the customer side. In-cloud is already running there, right? Their entire data plane is running and maintained over there as well already. So for us, this is a very small leap. And we work with different type of industries. And I think it's also an interesting take of what in-cloud represents, right? Besides, cost reduction and claiming responsibility for your data, it also represents the ability to basically support on-prem privacy, security-aware architecture, which I think the market is heavily shifting towards in the last few years. So that's kind of, one take on that.
Yeah, I live on the East Coast of the U.S., and that basically means I'm living in the industrial complex of government and military. So that's we go to a lot of conferences where there's a lot of Java and there's a lot of .NET. So, and those are very common requests, obviously, not just on-prem, but air-gapped modes and stuff like that. And it was cool to see, honestly, it's pretty cool to see a young startup that actually has those level of options, because the on-prem option always feels like it's something that people do in year 7 and year 10, or it's like their next big wave after they've had enough growth and they're like, okay, now can we go even bigger? Oh, let's go on-prem. But so that's pretty cool to have those options in such in earlier days of the product. And obviously there's minimum requirements, right? There's things that scale with the architecture. You talked a little bit about that there is the architecture of running the data storage in my own infrastructure. One of the things I'm not sure we mentioned was I can choose to run that in my own cluster. Like, you have a free option for running in the cluster with the apps itself. And then there's another option where you partner with the companies. Is that how you would describe it? Where you're going to run an architecture that they're managing, but you're going to manage the actual applications there. How does that work?
Yeah, so basically we mentioned it before when we looked at in-cloud managed. Let me just share the architecture for a second. It will allow us to better understand what we're seeing. So when you run Groundcover has a free tier. So when you run Groundcover and just deploy it, basically it will end up in what we call kind of an in-cluster architecture. Basically, it will mean that the sensor and the eBPF sensor itself and the backend as well will be running on your application cluster. Now, that is great, right? The UI is still served as a SaaS. All your components running on your premises, but it's not a great idea to run an observability database on your application cluster. You might be using Spot instances. We don't have any access to basically help you maintain that. And therefore, it's great for a free tier, but it doesn't fit as a sustainable architecture for the long run. Another reason it doesn't work for high-scale companies is because you don't have one cluster, right? You have 50. And you definitely want to share those in-cloud resources between multiple clusters for different reasons, for the ability to cross-section data from different clusters in the same backend, but also the ability to basically share resources and be more cost-effective. So when we work with actual companies that buy Groundcover and not just use the free tier, then we operate in what we call managed in-cloud architecture. Now, what it means is it's still the same, right? We're still using Victoria Metrics and ClickHouse or running them on the customer side. The only difference is that the customer doesn't deploy in cloud on their application cluster. They only deploy the agent, like they would do in Datadog and New Relic, only deploy the actual agent that collects the data on the application cluster. And this application cluster will basically ship data into the in-cloud from any cluster in their environment. Groundcover will have a control plane access to basically monitor and scale their in-cloud. So that's why we call it managed in-cloud. It will allow us to do all the variety of actions that we talked about at the beginning of the session, from monitoring it to basically make sure it's healthy, scale up, disaster recovery, anything that basically needs to happen in observability backend, but still do that in the customer's environment like we would do on the classical free tier. For us, it's kind of a grayscale between, kind of trying it out yourself, like you would just deploy Prometheus, to actually getting a vendor grade experience of not having to worry at all about what happens with this database. And that's kind of how we see it. So I hope that kind of answered the question.
Yeah. So in other words, if I'm a paying customer, I can still call you when the monitoring doesn't work, even though it's technically running on my infrastructure. And I just want to point out to everyone, by the way, like, we've had lots of, there's lots of monitoring tools out there. We've talked about monitoring observability for years now. It's been sort of a core part of this show. Once a quarter or so, once every 6 months, someone's coming on. We're talking about a little piece of that puzzle. And what I feel like is one of the best things that companies like yours have figured out how to do is that instead of what I used to do, which 15 years ago, even just 10 years ago, when I would switch or add a new monitoring solution, it was a complete rewrite of my brain. Like, there was nothing in common. And other than the general experience of, I run this command or this curl to install the agent. Like that was where the end of the similarities were. And in just in 10 years, in less than 10 years, we just talked about I'm thinking about all the things that I already know. A little bit of PromQL. I know a little bit of Kubernetes architecture. What was the other thing? Oh, I already know a little bit of Grafana dashboards. I know I have my favorites. I have some GitHub repos that I track, the different stuff that goes on there. And I feel now that with the open telemetry, we're going to ignore the eBPF stuff for a minute because that doesn't affect me as a user so much. But there's so many of these different technology stacks that now I can come to tools like yours and say, well, I already know how I'm going to query it. I already know what my dashboards are going to look like, and I'm going to probably use maybe I'm going to add my own in there. And I already know how it's going to deploy because I understand what a daemon set is and what a pod's going to look like and how you're going to set up the services. Like, it's not a completely foreign deployment thing for me. And I don't think you could have made Groundcover 10 years ago, because if you weren't doing it on Kubernetes, there's a lot of stuff there that I have to set up manually. And you might have some wizard automated install script, right? But it would still be, I think, a lot of services on a lot of servers that I don't really know how they all go together or how they even talk to each other.
I agree. I think the deployment of the sensor itself and the data that we collect about the ecosystem so quickly from Kubernetes is one thing. And basically in-cloud on the other end is one thing. The reason we turned to SaaS so quickly is because, proprietary management system in my backend as a vendor would make sense back then because there weren't too many tools to work with. Right now I can run in-cloud, on a remote cluster somewhere in the Philippines, right, at the customer's premises or whatever, and manage it for them, scale it up and down, make sure that it fits the actual load of data being pushed in. That couldn't happen even 5 or 6 years ago when we were just kind of starting this process with Kubernetes and the technologies running on top of it, because it's so profoundly different how these observability solutions worked 10 or 15 years ago.
Right.
They would build their stack, basically build these databases, right? They didn't have the solution like ClickHouse or Victoria, so you could just, spin out these databases, scale up on cluster modes on Kubernetes. I think that's a major shift as well from the backend perspective.
For sure. I feel like this is sort of a new standard it's obviously a trend. We're not pretending that you're the only ones that do some of these things, particularly when it comes to PromQL and Grafana dashboards, but it's still amazing how many players are on the market that don't do that. And mostly just because their legacy trying to catch up. They've invested a ton of time and resources in their own solutions like this. But I feel like, to me, as an end user, talking to other end users that are watching this show, it's like, this is the new standard. Like, if you're looking at products, if you're going to outsource this, if you don't have the 1 or 2 dedicated full-time people to manage your observability platform, then you should be looking at tools that complement that. I think one of the things I've seen in the past is where you can maybe run some of your own little stuff for free or for low cost on your non-production infrastructure. And that is compatible for you to move things you're experimenting with there, whether it's the QL statements, whether it's the dashboards that I've customized and figured out how the way I like it aligned, and that you can move those into the paid solution, and that you don't necessarily, it's not a completely 180 turn to be able to go from those kinds of toolings like open source Prometheus and that stack to something else. This is also a big deal because I just talked last week to some people about the fact that because we're rotating engineers nowadays, back when I started, you were in the same job 5-10 years. Like, that was very normal. Now we're down to like 2 years or less. And so in the constant rotation of engineers, you can't keep saying, well, our monitoring solution is completely different than everyone else's you've been to. So you're going to have to learn all that from scratch, right? We've learned that with languages and frameworks. We've learned that with standards and Docker and Kubernetes and YAML and all that stuff. And now I think that we're finally both, my 2 interests are observability and this kind of stuff happening in observability, and then the CI/CD deployment stuff. And we're starting to standardize on that with GitOps and containers as an artifact. And so I'm very excited on both sides of these, because it really means for us engineers, we can use Groundcover when we're able to use it. And if we can't, we don't have to completely throw out everything we've ever learned. And we can build on these. And that's just, honestly, it's cool stuff. I'm excited for that, because I feel like my knowledge, the Prometheus book, I think I got free 5 years ago from a KubeCon, and I read it at home 6 or 7 years ago or whatever. Like, that knowledge is still valuable to me, and I can still use new products coming out with that knowledge and understanding of metrics and endpoints and what Prometheus data scraping looks like and all that. So do we want to look at something real quick before we jump off?
Yeah.
Got to start learning PromQL. Sorry. But hey, look, the great thing is once you learn a little bit of it, there's tons of cheat sheets out there. There's tons of helper tools. Once you learn a little bit of it, it gets easier. And then nice thing is you can just use it everywhere. You can use it on all these different tools. So not horrible. All right.
Just gonna give you the 2-minute tour of Groundcover. So deploying the system is very easy, as we mentioned. This is the deployment of the sensor itself. We have a CLI tool behind the scenes. It's a helm chart. You can automate it with Flux, Argo. You mentioned these technologies, in the past. It's definitely easy to deploy the sensor however you want to. And you can already see, this is kind of a Kubernetes monitoring, page of seeing all the deployments running in your cluster. You can already see hints of eBPF with, request per second, error rate, and latency appearing on these services. Now, if we dive into one of them, then all this just happens out of the box, right? Without doing anything. First, we can see the Kubernetes layer part of the availability of the workload. If there's any crashes, we'll match the Kubernetes events to them. Monitors that Groundcover provides, like pod restarts, out of memories and stuff like that. We can already see the dependency map of that service discovered by eBPF, which I'll show you in a second. And we also show a detailed resource consumption page of per pod compared to the limits or request that you've set, the node resources that it's running on, and even what we call a noisy neighbor analysis, which is super relevant for Kubernetes, which deployment are running beside my deployment on the same node and how much are they taking, up to basically an APM, right? So Groundcover detects all the endpoints, HTTP, APIs, DB queries, cache queries, anything you're doing both inbound and outbound. And you can look at them as request per second, error rate, and latency over time. And you can also drill down to the specific APIs, as we'll see in a second. Now, looking at that from a more, kind of dependency map perspective, this is agile and collected on the fly with eBPF. So we can basically see who's communicating with who, and also layer metrics on top of that to know throughput and error rate on each of these edges. And by clicking on a specific edge, we can already dive deep into how deep eBPF can get, right? So we're seeing traces being collected with no code instrumentation at all. And they go as deep as the actual payload and headers of the request and the response. So you can see, the full context of the request, the URI itself, the protocol, the status code, the latency, but also get the full payload to reconstruct the issue and easily basically see what's going on without guessing what that span represented, like we have in OpenTelemetry and other vendors, which is very powerful. Together with attributes that we collect that might indicate whether it was encrypted or included PII or information about the host, and actually the correlation of logs that we do in the same sensor, as we mentioned before, correlating, say, error logs around the time of the actual trace. You can get a lot of context immediately for just deploying that daemon set. Even the context of metrics from the infrastructure around the trace you're looking at. Was the container busy? Was the node close to being from? And so on. And Groundcover does it all across the many different verticals we operate in. A cool example would be looking at our API catalog, which depicts all the endpoints that the eBPF sensor detects. Now, when thinking about HTTP APIs and things like that, it's more common, but Groundcover also does that for protocols like Postgres. So in this demo, we're looking at, you can see the RDS, the AWS RDS host name here. Basically, this is an SQL cluster outside the of the Kubernetes cluster we're monitoring, right? So we can see the client basically running these queries on top of the remote RDS as the eBPF sensor is catching the client side. And we can also already see the endpoint metrics of the error rate and the number of queries per second. And we can do cool stuff like sort by latency and very easily get to the slowest query and get actual examples collected by the sensor of the query itself and the actual parameters.
You're talking my language right now.
I'm sure.
I've lost count of the number of times that I've had to go back to either the database team or the development team and say, hey, look, your problem isn't my servers. It's your query isn't indexed, or your query is just bad or whatever. And usually, it wasn't that long ago that you would have to, this would require an entire project just to know this information. You'd have to set up, you didn't have production tracing because that was a no-no and up until very recently, because it was going to affect the performance. And so you would not have tracing, and then you would have to simulate these things. And it was a lot. It's a lot of work. And you're just casually clicking on, like, this is what I did. I don't think you realize, for those of us with a little gray in our beards, like, the ease of which you're able to pull this information, because you're talking about doing all this without an SDK, right? Like I don't have to plug this thing into my lines of code.
It would just start flowing like 2 minutes after you deployed daemon stuff, which I think is like very, very powerful, right, for our first experience.
Yeah. Yeah, someone's asking about if someone's using managed resources like Azure Postgres and it's utilizing my Kubernetes application, can I see Groundcover monitoring that database as well?
Yeah, so we didn't mention that in the initial discussion, but basically we mentioned, Groundcover using Victoria metrics and ClickHouse behind the scenes to basically monitor and kind of store the data. We chose Grafana as our visualization source on top of that. So basically you can actually see, we're looking at Grafana right now and looking at Groundcover metrics that we collect. These are metrics collected and stored in the Groundcover Victoria metrics. And Grafana supports a ton of integrations, right? So you can definitely integrate with any cloud resource as a data source to our Grafana. We also support unique integrations from, say, AWS Kinesis and stuff like that can also be served as push into our databases. But from just monitoring cloud resource metrics like Azure resources or AWS resources, the Grafana integrations themselves can basically bring in the same metrics to the same place as all the metrics we're providing. And therefore, you can do a lot of cross-section and cool stuff.
Yeah, so I'm not using a bunch of your plugins that you have to keep going. I can just focus on Grafana.
Exactly. It allows to create a shortcut to a lot of the integrations that we believe you should have.
Very cool. I feel like, honestly, we're not doing it justice. We could have spent another hour giving you a demo walkthrough there. But the nice thing is, on the website, this is what I was doing before the show, because I didn't get a chance to deploy it, and I wanted to know a little bit of the basics. So I was on their website, and they have a new playground, which indeed gave me an interface with some data in it. And I was just poking around because I was planning on deploying a bunch of stuff on my own Kubernetes. And then I realized, oh, this is much easier. This is so much easier than me having to do all this myself. So for those of you that just want to poke around real quick, I mean, that's an option. You did mention a free tier?
Yeah, we have a free tier up to 1 Kubernetes cluster, no matter the size, fully featured, up to 3 users on that cluster. So you can just install Groundcover from the UI immediately and get started and basically check it out on your data, which is sometimes more significant to you than our demo. But yeah.
Yeah, especially if you've already got something in place. Like I feel like sometimes I don't know what I'm looking for until I've actually run something and I have whatever the legacy solution my team has been using for a while, and we're just looking at it. We figure out some dashboards. We figure out what's really important, our problem areas, the parts of the code that seem to be problems that we're really focusing on that. And then when I want to look at something, a similar product or a competing product, I'll often try, maybe not in the production cluster, but I'll often try to load up both. Hopefully they work side by side. They don't mess with each other. I don't think that's a common thing anymore. And probably with eBPF, it's completely fine. But that allows me to very quickly go, okay, I know this is what I care about. Let me look in this one over here and see if I can emulate that, or if it has it built in, or if I can figure out how to make that work. I feel like sometimes for people that are getting started in learning, you just don't know what to consider. You don't know what to look at. Like you see all these stats and they're very interesting, but which ones of these are actionable and which ones are vanity metrics is always a real challenge for people. So if you've got something, throw it on there and compare it to what you've got. Otherwise, hey, they got the playground in the free account. So if you don't have any of your own data, you can always use the playground. And you had I just should point out lastly that you had a wide support for a lot of different distributions of Kubernetes, all the cloud distributions I saw there. Even micro-K8s was an option, which is one of my favorites for running locally and learning Kubernetes on.
Yeah.
And
yeah, basically we're native to Kubernetes. We can run almost on any flavor of Kubernetes, including the heavy-duty enterprise stuff like OpenShift and stuff like that, all the way through, the light bare metal versions of Kubernetes. So kind of supporting all of them.
Nice. That's the wonders of the standard Kubernetes API. So Groundcover has a YouTube channel. They've got, by the way, we didn't even mention this. This is the next show that we'll have to have you back on. You have a Groundcover Caretta. Is that how you say it? Caretta?
Yeah, Caretta. Caretta is kind of our sneak peek into what we're doing with the sensor. It allows you to see a dependency map on the network level, not necessarily kind of the application level, but it's a cool example for people who want to say, show me the power of the eBPF and also throw it on the Grafana dashboard, because that's how I know how to operate. And we kind of dip that in the dependency map that Grafana offers and basically show people what you can do with eBPF.
I saw that, yeah, number 2 product of the week in developer tools on Product Hunt. That's pretty awesome.
It's a pretty cool tool. It's kind of an intro to what Groundcover is doing. But if you want to check out what you can do with eBPF, go and check it out. We have a support channel that deals with Caretta on our community Slack, and always open for suggestions.
Nice. And I'm guessing that the Discord and Slack communities, they can get all that on the front page. So you have the stuff on GitHub, you have the YouTube channel, you can find them on LinkedIn, all the socials. I mean, they know what they're doing. They've got the standard social stack for getting a hold of them. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been great. I was excited to have you on. I loved your approach because I'm on the infrastructure side. This idea around allowing me to have some of the SaaS conveniences and the security of I think it's OpenID or whatever you're doing on the back end there for allowing me access to the portal. Sometimes it's weird how that can be some of the hardest parts if you're trying to deploy stuff yourself. Let's Encrypt makes it a little bit easier nowadays, but just trying to get everything integrated with authentication, make sure that my portal's secure, that I'm adding the users I need to add. Like, that's not trivial. A lot of things, even Argo CD, when you're deploying Argo CD in a cluster, everybody wants to see access to it. Then you have to figure out authentication, users, databases, all that stuff. So that's actually a pretty cool idea, I think, of some of that hard stuff you guys keep running like you said, we can run it ourselves if we want to. But in order to simplify costs, I can just run, and like you said, for security, especially those logs, which I don't remember the last time I was with a company that we didn't have some sort of log incident. It's not always like AWS keys. It's maybe something a little bit less traumatic, but there's always something that gets in the logs and we're like, that shouldn't be there. We need to use Fluentbit or something to keep that out of the data stack. So the fact that I can keep that on my clusters and will probably keep my security team happy, it's a pretty cool tool as well for the design. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Yeah, I think I'm glad. I'm excited to see what's next for you all. I don't know if you have any hot takes for us real quick on what's next. Do you have the inside track? You're a non-public company, so I get to ask you that.
Yeah, we're going to release a ton of new features around experience we call monitors, which you saw a sneak peek into our demo. It basically means the Groundcover alerting system is going to move off Grafana into something that you can define and control through the Groundcover experience. That's one of the things that we're going to release very soon, a lot of stuff with a lot of other cool stuff are coming up quickly.
Well, thanks for being here, Shahar. I appreciate it. Groundcover, just Google it. You'll find all the things. You're either going to see plant stuff, but if you just type in Groundcover Kubernetes, and you get all the things. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.